What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of All Sports Talk with Peter Burnett, bringing you another college basketball episode. We're going to be diving into yesterday's big game, talk a little bit about, real briefly, about another ranked matchup, and then dive into a little bit of a debate on which team is the best team in the women's basketball game. And so starting out last night, number 13 Kansas State hosting number 2 Kansas, the Sunflower Showdown between the Wildcats and the Jayhawks. K-State started the game strong. They jumped ahead, 10-0 run, led them to a double-digit lead early that grew to 14, 31-17 about midway through the first half. The Jayhawks, though, were able to trim into that deficit. They cut it down to as little as 2 in the first half. It was 44-39 Wildcats at the break. The Jayhawks continued that momentum into the second half. They led 58-57, leading the way, as he has been this season, and sometimes accompanied by Grady Dick, but really in this game, it was Jalen Wilson standing out for both teams, really, but for the Jayhawks especially. Poured in 38 points, added 9 rebounds for Kansas. He was, almost exactly 50% from the field, 12 for 25, and he was also nearly perfect from the line, 11 for 12. So a huge game for Jalen Wilson as he continues to shine for the Jayhawks through this season. Again, both teams kind of went back and forth down the rest of the stretch. A couple of missed chances for both teams at the end of regulation, but the game remained tied, went into overtime, 72-all. In overtime, K-State and Kansas both were able to get shots to fall and get points on the board, but the biggest play on offense, at least, came when Keontae Johnson caught a lob, gave him 24 points in the game. Big-time lob, got it just over the Kansas defender and threw it down to give them an 83-82 lead. And Desi Sills was another player who stepped up. He was the player who was tied with Johnson with 24 points off the bench, and then he made a key defensive stop on the final play of the game against the Jayhawks. Made a big play, forced. I think probably Wilson had the ball, forced him to turn the ball over, and Kansas State held on for a huge win. The fans stormed the court, went over the defending champion and now number 2 overall team. And the Wildcats bounced back from a loss to TCU and proved that even in a very competitive Big 12 conference, they are a genuine contender. They only have 2 losses so far. I think it brings them either to 16 or 17-2 on the season. And so a big win picked up for the Wildcats on their home court. The other big game in the Big 12 was between Iowa State and Texas. Jaron Holmes poured in 21 points for the Cyclones in a big second half as they kind of ran away from Texas. It still remained within reach, but a 78-67 win for the 12th-ranked Cyclones over the 7th-ranked Longhorns. So quick just kind of point I wanted to make on the Big 12 in men's college basketball. It really is, I think, wide open. You've got 6 teams right now that are ranked. 3 of those teams have just 1 loss in conference play through 6 games. Texas and TCU both have a pair of losses, and then Baylor has 3 Big 12 losses. But even the 4 teams that aren't ranked, Oklahoma 11-6, Oklahoma State 9-8, West Virginia 10-7, and Texas Tech 10-8. So every team in the conference is above 500 and playing, competitive basketball against each other as well. One of the conferences that has often been kind of in that spotlight as the number 1 conference in college basketball is the Big Ten. And I think they're definitely still a competitor. I think both of those conferences, top to bottom, are probably the best in college basketball. I think the Big 12, though, is a little bit more even. Looking at the Big 10 standings, you got Purdue 17-1. They're leading the conference, number 3 in the country. And then at the bottom, you've got Minnesota, who certainly isn't bad by any stretch in terms of the whole college basketball landscape. 7-9, though. They're about to play. And so it's the sort of matchup that will kind of show a little bit of a picture of just how competitive the Big Ten is. by whether Purdue absolutely steamrolls through the Golden Gophers or whether the Boilermakers are kind of held close. So kind of I think the debate of which conference is the deepest, the most even. There are obviously fewer teams in the Big 12. I think that lends a little bit of credence to the debate of which conference is more even and which one is the deepest conference. But both of those conferences have always been at the forefront of college basketball and continue to be so this year. Rounding out the men's college basketball coverage, couple of big games on Saturday. TCU takes on Kansas. Kansas obviously looking to bounce back, and then UCLA in the Pac-12's showcase game on Saturday. But now shifting gears, I wanted to dive into, for the first time on this channel, women's college basketball, because it is definitely a sport that deserves more coverage than it gets. It's getting better. Things are getting better and becoming more opportune for women's college basketball players, but certainly something that I think needs to have more attention brought to it. And so for this one, I want to kind of break it down similar to what I did in a previous video on this channel, kind of going over which team is the best in college basketball. So obviously starting out, you got to start out with the South Carolina Gamecocks. They have been at the top of college basketball, women's college basketball recently, and continue to do so. They're 18-0. They have 3 ranked wins, one of them over Stanford, who's a top 4 team right now. I'll get into them a little bit later and explain why they're not quite up for debate for the single number 1 best team, but they certainly are in contention for being a team that could potentially win the title. I know that might seem like it's kind of isn't that the same thing? But to explain it shortly, I would say, the number 1 team is the team that is simply the best team. It just has the resume and the wins to back up that ranking. But a title contender is a team that might not be that number 1 level, but on any given night, on a championship game, they could step up and could compete. So going over the Gamecocks now, again, we'll talk about Stanford later. The Gamecocks have the best defense in the country, giving up just 45.6 points per game, one of the lowest field goal percentages as well by opponents, 28.7%. And they also have 5 players with at least 1.2 blocks per game. A lot of times, you'll have players on teams, maybe you'll have a couple, maybe 3 players that'll have a block or more per game, and that would be a really good defensive presence. But the Gamecocks, again, have 5 players who are recording at least, a block per game, and 4 out of those 5 are recording almost a block and a half per game. So that's a big part of their defensive presence. Of course, also the guard play of Zaya Cook, averaging 15.3 points per game, and then down low in the post and kind of on the wings a little bit, Aaliyah Boston, 12.5 points per game. She has almost 2 blocks per game herself, and then 9.4 rebounds per game. And another one of those forces down in the paint is Camila Cardoso with 9.4 points and 7.5 points per game. So a really well-rounded team, and obviously they've already proven themselves as the best in college basketball, and they continue to do so with big wins. But a team that I think it's between these two. I'll talk about the other teams that are potentially, contenders for this, but really it's a two-horse race right now. 2 of 3 undefeated teams, and again, I'll explain why the third undefeated team maybe doesn't quite stack up right now, but that's the Ohio State Buckeyes. The Buckeye women's basketball team has been a turnover forcing machine. They are averaging 23.3 forced turnovers per game. It's the best in Power 5. It's not quite the best in college basketball overall, but they just from watching, really, as a Buckeye fan, they're the team in women's college basketball that I've watched the most so far this year, and they're all over the place. They're forcing teams to be uncomfortable on offense, forcing bad decisions, And the other thing too is, you have a player like J.C. Sheldon who has recently been out with an injury, but she's averaging 6 steals per game, something that Sheldon and the rest of the Buckeye defense have been doing really well this year, is just forcing those mistakes. So it's not only getting the steals, but it's kind of maybe forcing a bad pass that goes out of bounds, or forcing a travel or a double dribble or something like that. And so that's been the Buckeyes' strength this season. And then offensively, Sheldon also is second on the team with 16 points per game. But Taylor Mikesell has been the main offensive producer with 18.6 points per game. And then for the Buckeyes in steals as well, they've got 4 players with at least 1.6 steals per game, along with, not including J.C. Sheldon. So they've got 5 players total with at least 1.5 steals per game. But I think that's what makes the Buckeyes the number 2 team. And maybe it's a little bit of my Ohio bias kicking in, but the fact that they have 4 ranked wins, maybe not quite the same as what South Carolina's win over Stanford is, but 4 ranked wins is tough to do, and to be undefeated as well. They are, I think, very, very even with the Gamecocks, and potentially maybe even deserve to be ranked number 1, but I don't think that'll come until South Carolina loses or until the tournament, if the Buckeyes were to beat the Gamecocks. But rounding out some of these other teams, again, that I would say more are contenders than contenders for that number 1 spot. That's the LSU Tigers. They're the best offense in college basketball, averaging 88.7 points per game. They're led by Angel Reese, 23.9 points per game, also grabbing 15.4 rebounds, and Alexis Morris with 12.8 points and dishing out the assists with 4.9 per game. They play in a pretty, I would say, top half heavy SEC, and right now there's only 1 team ranked. That's South Carolina. Obviously, they'll face them. I think maybe in about a month, LSU will face the Gamecocks. But Ole Miss 16-3, Arkansas 17-3, and Alabama 14-4. Obviously, Tennessee's around in there too. They're 14-6, but kind of they'll be able to start boosting that resume a little bit and maybe make a move up, up into those kind of top two spots. The coaches still have them behind Stanford, but the AP poll does have them in that number 3 spot. But ahead of them by the coaches is the Stanford Cardinal. They just recently fell, and obviously early in the season had a tough overtime loss. That was how that game went. It was a battle between the Gamecocks and the Cardinal. Stanford just lost at USC, so kind of a big blow to their resume for being number 1, but still a very solid team led by Cameron Brink with 13.6 points per game, 9.7 rebounds, and 3.3 blocks per game. And then obviously Haley Jones, 13.1 points, 8.3 boards, and 3.8 assists. Both of those two were obviously instrumental to Stanford winning the national championship 2 years ago, and continue to do so for the Cardinal as they continue to be one of the top at least top 5 teams in college basketball, probably one of the top 3 or 4. And then finally, rounding it out is the dynastic team that has obviously recently been overtaken by teams like Stanford, like South Carolina, and Mississippi State. I think a few years ago. Now it's probably been several years now. But that's the Connecticut Huskies. They're 17-2. They've dealt with injuries. Obviously, Paige Beckers has been out for the whole season. Azif Fudd has only played 9 games. When she does, she leads the team with 17.9 points per game. Aaliyah Edwards has stepped up, 16.7 points per game, 9.5 rebounds. And then a couple of their other key players are Dorka Juhas with 14.5 points and 11.1 rebounds, and then their distributor is Nika Mool with 9.1 assists, also averaging 6.7 points per game. And so again, to round out this discussion over who is the top team in women's college basketball, it's tough because in one regard, South Carolina has established themselves as that top team over the last several years and have that national championship. But if you're looking at this season, standalone, the Ohio State Buckeyes are clearly a real contender to overtake that crown. Both teams are defensive masters, and any offense in college basketball wouldn't want to come up against either one of those defenses. And so if I had to make a decision, I think I would go, again, maybe it's a little bit of bias, but I think I would go with the Ohio State Buckeyes as the number one overall team. And again, talked about it. They're similar on defense. They allow a little bit more scoring, but they are so much more disruptive with all the turnovers forced. And offensively, I think they're maybe a little bit more versatile. Another name I didn't mention is Rebecca Mikula-Sitkova, I think is how you say it, Sitkova. She has 14.4 points per game. So a real well-rounded team. And if we're looking at this season alone, I would put the Buckeyes ahead of the Gamecocks. But that's it for this college basketball kind of midweek breakdown. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like. I'd love to hear your thoughts on which conference, Big 12, Big 10, and men's college basketball is the best, and also who you think is the best women's basketball team. But that's been it for this episode of All Sports Talk. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. I'm Peter, signing out. Peace.